talking about the nativity scene. We talked a lot about Matthew last time. Tonight we're going to talk about Luke, and then we're going to talk about why there's nothing in Mark and John. Somebody referred to Mark's gospel as the Christmas without a crib. We know it was a cute way of looking at it. Most of us are pretty familiar with the Gospel of Luke's account, Luke 2. Probably if we read it out in King James, you could just follow right along with us and quote it right along. Because that's the story we hear the most about. It's used the most often in our Christmas plays. It's kind of where we get that idea about the Christmas play. We talked a lot about what is and isn't really in the Bible story last time we were here. Anybody have any reactions or remember anything about that, or did it make you think? I think Jean and Sandra were the only ones here, I think. Or no, Kelly was here. We just talked about the fact that when we think about the Christmas story, we think it says that there were 3 wise men. And it doesn't. It says they had 3 gifts. And usually people in that time, when they traveled in these, I want to call it a safari, caravan, and they went to something really important, there would have been more than 3 important people traveling. Also, things like the shepherds were told to go find the baby, and what was going to be their sign? A baby. Whereas the wise men had been following a star for who knows how long. Come on in. And so it's just interesting how we. Don't look at the camera. Don't look at the camera. It's just interesting how we think it says a certain thing and it says something else. Talking about Luke for just a minute. You start out, if you go to Luke 2, and the story just kind of jumps in. Doesn't give a lot of genealogy like in Matthew. He said Matthew had all that genealogy because he was having to prove that Jesus was Jewish. And they do that through the father, Joseph, even though that was not his actual father. They do that through that line. But when you look at Luke chapter 2, there's no genealogy. And you wonder why, if it was so important for Matthew to have these 25,000 people, why doesn't Luke? Later on, Luke talks about it a little bit. Also, in Luke, he's showing that Jesus is different and supreme to John the Baptist. We also have the issue here where about Mary and Joseph. We're going to read through some of this in a minute just because it's so familiar, but maybe we can find some new stuff in it. Also, in Luke's, there's no magi. There's no magi, just the shepherds. And one of the reasons behind that is Luke was writing to Roman readers. And they tried to avoid having anything that would look like it was in competition with the emperor. And if he started talking about these important people from the east that came, people could have thought that was trying to overthrow the Romans. Now shepherds, they were just good old guys. Good old guys. And not all the shepherds were guys, I'm sure, because in the Bible when it names shepherds, it's women. It's women. When you think about, is it Rebecca? When Jacob came to find a wife, she was out tending the sheep, tending the cattle and the sheep. So it's easier for him to do this. It's interesting in these because Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were all written at different times to different people. You kind of get this picture, they were sitting down at a table, and you said, okay, you tell this part, and I'll tell this part, and I'll tell this part, and that's not how it happened. In fact, when John wrote his gospel, it was 20 years later. And one of the reasons, we'll talk about that in a minute, why he doesn't have the nativity scene, everybody already knew it. He went for something a little bit higher, a little bit different. So these shepherds would be less threatening than foreigners. You're not from here, are you? You ain't from here. So let's look at the Luke account for just a couple of minutes. Like I said, you've heard this over and over and over and over. Some of it we heard just last Sunday. Because of that, I'm going to be bouncing back and forth with NIV and Message. About that time, Caesar Augustus ordered a census to be taken throughout the empire. Giving you some little tidbits through here. The Jewish people did not like a census taken by another government or another power. Now, in the Old Testament, they're forever counting people. When they take a census in the Old Testament, they only counted the men, and they did it to see how many soldiers they would have. Did they have enough soldiers? So they didn't like another country or another government counting them, because they felt like that might let them know how few there were, if there were too many, how that would work. For a census, when Cyrenius was governor of Syria, everyone had to travel to his own ancestral hometown to be accounted for. Again, you were where you were from, where your family was from. Now, most of us did not grow up in Roanoke. Some of us did. I was born in Roanoke years and years and years ago. But in this time, there was all that family connection. And if you talk to any friends that are Jewish, there's still a strong family connection. Joseph went from the Galilean town of Nazareth up to Bethlehem in Judea. Now, I've always pictured that as being a really long journey. And it was. If I remember right, it was about 60 miles. How did they get there? What was the transportation that Mary and Joseph used? How did they get there? What do we usually see how they got there? In pictures and art.
A donkey.
A donkey. And there's always Mary, big old pregnant Mary on the donkey, and poor old Joseph trotting along beside her. In the story we'll see here in a minute, right then, it doesn't say anything about how they got there. That was what the usual was. As a descendant of David, he had to go to Bethlehem. He went with Mary, his fiancée, who was pregnant. Now, just like today, that might cause some raised eyebrows. I'm sure it did then, too. While they were there, the time came for her to give birth. She gave birth to a son, her firstborn. She wrapped him in a blanket and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the hostel or the inn. Again, how many times have you heard the sermon about that mean old innkeeper who wouldn't give Mary and Joseph not even a place out in the barn? Sounds like something we'll hear Saturday night. And yet it doesn't say that. You get the impression the town was busy and there wasn't a place. But we're so easily pulled into, I call it the Christian Hallmark version of how we think the story's supposed to be. And then the shepherd story. And again, this gets into, if we look at December 25th, probably there were not shepherds in the field watching their flocks. Why? Because they would be there when the lambs were born in the spring. And we're going to talk a bit about it's December 25th. Not trying to blow your Christmas, just throwing some things in. God's angels stood among them, and God's glory blazed around them. They were terrified. And the angels said what angels always say when they show up: don't be afraid. I'm here to announce a great and joyful event that is meant for everybody worldwide. Okay, remember Luke was writing to the Gentiles? He was writing to not just Jewish people. So it was important for them to see this Jesus guy was for everyone. The Savior has been born, just been born in David's town, a Savior who is the Messiah Master. This is what you're to look for: a baby wrapped in a blanket, lying in a manger. I told you before, I think, that I always remember hearing that in King James. You'll go and you'll find Mary, Joseph, and the babe wrapped in a manger. And I always, in my little mind as a kid, thought they must have like a king-size bed, because I saw Mary and Joseph and the babe. Oh, anyway. Strange. And then we have the singing. Now, one of the most amazing things to me is what happens next. Somebody read verses 15 to 18, please, in whatever version you have.
As the angel choir withdrew into heaven, the sheepherders talked it over. Let's get over to Bethlehem as fast as we can and see for ourselves what God has revealed to us. They left running and found Mary and Joseph and the baby lying in the manger. Seeing was believing. They told everyone they met what the angels had said about this child. All who heard the sheepherders were impressed.
See anything surprising there? Remember, now shepherds were those stinky people that stayed out in the field most of the time. They were seen kind of as ruffians. What did they do when they heard about this baby? They took off running to find him. Now, again, my thought has always been who took care of the sheep while they were gone. But they took off running to Bethlehem. Just on the word of an angel. And I say that just, but on the other hand, don't you think somebody stood there and said, what did we have for dinner last night? You know? Could this be? And then they go running into town where they, for the most part, were kept out of. And they find this baby that the angels had talked about. And then what's the next thing they did after they see the baby?
Told everybody they met.
They told everyone they met. Again, you're a respectable person in town. And this shepherd comes running up to tell you they saw an angel, and there was a baby, and it was going to be the Savior. Is that not anybody else's totally ludicrous? You know,
Yeah.
What's interesting is that the story kept happening. The story, if I were writing the Bible, there's a lot of things I'd rewrite and try to express in a different way. And that's kind of the nativity scene there in Luke. Now, knowing what we said about him having written to the Gentiles, it makes a little more sense why he left out some things and why he included some things. If you had opportunity during the last couple of weeks and you looked at Mark, what kind of manger scene did he have? Mark was supposedly the first gospel written, and I think he got a lot of his information from Peter. Of course, none of these folks were present for the birthing. Is there anything in Mark about baby Jesus? No. Starts out talking about John the Baptist. John the Baptist. Mark was being written to the Romans of his time, and I think he left out some things because secrecy at that time was very important. You didn't want to tell everything, especially the Jewish community, because they didn't want the Romans knowing everything. So when he wrote his first gospel, he didn't include that in it. And it wasn't important at that point. Again, folks, these were written around 60 AD, the first one. So Jesus had been gone 30 years, and now they're telling the story. Like I said the other week, I think it's because they thought Jesus was coming right back, so nobody had to write anything down. And when he didn't, they figured they better tell the story. Look at Mark chapter 6, verses 1 to 3. This is how we know that Mark was not ignorant about what happened. It just wasn't part of his story. Jesus left there and returned to his hometown. His disciples came along. On the Sabbath, he gave a lecture to the meeting place. He made a real hit, impressing everyone. We had no idea he was this good, they said. How did he get so wise all of a sudden? Get such ability? But in the next breath, they were cutting him down. He's just a carpenter, Mary's boy. We've known him since he was a kid. So Mark knew this Joseph-Mary story. It just wasn't important for him to tell. He also, if you've ever been with me, we studied Mark. Do you remember what one of the most important or the most obvious factors in the Gospel of Mark is? First of all, it's the shortest Gospel. And if you're reading there, the word immediately shows up all the time, because they go from one event to one event to one event. And he had such urgency because he was the first one telling the story. He got past that baby stuff and got on to telling the other things that Jesus did. Also, the first Christians, early Christians, didn't celebrate Christmas with the intensity that we do. Of Mark's Gospels, only 8 of his manuscripts, only 8 have survived from the early days. Now let's talk for just a minute about why do we celebrate Christmas on December 25th?
Because they told us to.
Who they? Say what?
That was good.
You know, nobody knows the birth date or year. We do this BC, AD, BCE, AD. But nobody knew the year, and nobody knew the date. And dates were kept, the calendar changed, even during all this time. So why in the world did we end up with December 25th? And we celebrate the 25th. Orthodox Christians celebrate it when? January 6th, like the Greek Orthodox. There are two things about that, why it may be December 25th. First of all, there was a pagan solstice holiday about this same time. And Christians were just sitting there because they didn't worship those pagan gods anymore, and they're all out having parties. So it was thought that that was one reason why they may have picked up on this time frame. So they had something to celebrate also. The other thing is, there's a very important Jewish holiday that happens about the same time. You know what that is? Hanukkah. Hanukkah. And the early Christians, at least the Jewish early Christians, they were used to celebrating during that time. And that's one of the most fascinating, if you read the story about how they celebrate Hanukkah, it's just amazing. And so it would be easy, well, we're used to having a holiday during this time, maybe we could make it Jesus' birthday. The date wasn't actually set until 336 AD. And just because, why? Because this one leader decided that that's when he was going to do it. He just said, this is the date. Isn't that funny how we just think it's so set in stone, ironclad, that it has to be a certain time? Just amazing me. So Mark knew about these things, but he had more important things to get to. More important things to get to. And since it's the oldest, I'm surprised it's not the first when you think about the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke. Let's go over to John for just a minute. Back when inclusive language was really intense in MCC, first verses of John were very hard to read inclusively. And you'll see why. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. That light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. Is there anything about, is Jesus named there? It was interesting because then in the next verse he starts talking about John the Baptist. I wonder how many people have read this and thought that perhaps the he in all this was John the Baptist. Now if you know what we've talked about John before, that he also was writing to pretty much to a mixed group of people, not just Christians or not just non-Christian, not just Jewish or non-Jewish. But again, the story's been in circulation 20 years. There's some stories about MCC that when I start to tell it, you roll your eyes and think, oh God, I've heard that before. But there are other people sitting there who've never heard that story, who don't know the stories. So most of you in here, except for two, I think, I can tell Kirk Avenue stories. You know what I'm talking about. Some of you know about it because you've heard about it. Oh, you weren't at Kirk Avenue either, were you?
Heard about it, that wasn't.
Yeah. And so John, the other two Gospels, of the three Gospels, have been out in circulation for almost 20 years when John starts to tell his story. You can almost imagine him saying, what can I tell different? What else needs to be told? They know about the shepherds, they know about the wise men. What else needs to be told? And so he kind of cuts directly to this cataclysmic event that he sees as the most important event in human history. He cuts directly to this profound message that God became human and lived among us. Look at what those verses say again. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Some people think Jesus just kind of popped on the scene, but if you think about the Trinity, think about the Genesis, the words that are used, Jesus was already there. And then he's talking about, again he's writing to people who had all kinds of gods. There was a god of the trees, there was a god of the animals, there was a god of all these things, and he's saying, our guy started it all. And he goes to a deeper story, a deeper image. John may leave out the nativity scene, but 90% of what he writes isn't in any of the other Gospels. I never realized that till I was studying this week, 90%, because he gets into some really profound things, especially the last week of Jesus' life. And again, nobody was there for the birth, so he could just go to the deeper things. Then he starts talking about John, and he knew, because of when he lived, he knew that John had been heard about. During the time before Jesus came and before he started his ministry, there were a lot of people claiming to be the Messiah. And some people thought it was going to be John, because he had a new message, a neat message, and he was a little different, running around his skins and eating locusts. So John then has to talk about John the Baptist, but he has to make sure they understand that Jesus is greater. Jesus is greater. That's why he started out in the very beginning of that like he did. He goes on talking about John. And if you remember, John actually has to tell people that he is not the Christ. In verse 19, 119. Now this was John's testimony, when the Jews of Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to ask who he was. He did not fail to confess, but confessed freely, I am not the Christ. So again, John's telling this story long after everybody's heard it over and over and over, and they've heard about John the Baptist. He wants to make sure there's no misunderstanding. What's the most important part of the Christmas story? We've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What's the most important part to you? What would it be if you came to church and they were talking about Christmas and they left out blank? Would make you go, wait a minute, they left out
Jesus being born. I know that's a no-brainer, but
well, you know, there's a lot to the story that's, we just hear it. He does a quick appearance.
yes.
He gets born, wrapped in a blanket, and put in a manger. That's an important part. Who gets talked about the least in the Christmas story? We got angels, shepherds, wise men, Mary, Joseph, the baby. Who gets the least print?
Joseph.
Joseph. Joseph. You know, he's the one who's got the pregnant fiance. And that's about all we hear about him, although I'll be preaching about him on Sunday. But he has a very important, but he doesn't get a lot of print. And people have thought the reason for that is through the years, Mary has become so much more important, especially in the Catholic faith. I find it interesting that people today, if you go into Barnes & Noble and look at the Christmas cards, you know, they have that table, if you've seen it, filled with all kinds of boxed Christmas cards. I was there today looking at something, and I looked around and I thought, there are 3 boxes that have a manger scene on them, and there's probably 50 that have other things. Why is that our culture today that would be in the negative like that, in the smaller amount? Some of it, I think, is Christianity is just kind of fallen to the side because of how some people portray Christianity. Other times, people just kind of want something a little bit different. I've heard so many Christmas plays and so many little scenes and seen so many scenes in Christmas movies about the birth of Jesus. And you kind of go, we got it. But the people that these folks were writing to had not heard it over and over and over. And that's why, especially Matthew and Luke, have to go into such detail. A lot of people, even in that day, thought, well, what did it matter about this? It's more important what he taught, what he did, died on the cross, being raised from the dead. And yet for some people, knowing that human origin, you know, there's a whole school of thought that says Jesus was divine and human, but really divine just kind of hanging out in the human body a little bit. We can get into all kinds of that stuff. But in telling these manger stories, they're talking about being an actual human being. All right, I'm not gonna, if I kept going, I'd be telling you about my sermon on Joseph. I don't want you sitting there going, huh, I've heard this before. But I hope that in the days we have left before Christmas, you'll go back and read through some of these, Matthew and Luke again, and let it speak to you, not as, oh my gosh, I've always heard it, but let it speak to you and look at it as if you were there. When I taught in a Christian school, and one of the writing assignments at Christmas, I asked the kids to tell me the Christmas story as if they were one of the participants. You know, so people would write like they were a shepherd, or they were a magi, or a couple of them took on Mary and Joseph, a couple took on the baby Jesus. One of the neatest ones, and I wish I'd kept that copy, one guy talked to us as if he were the manger. As if he were the manger, and how he'd just been there to feed cows and stuff all these years, and suddenly it's different, you know. It was just so cool to think about that. Any last minute prayer requests or praises? Gonna have lots of people traveling in the next couple of weeks, in addition to Jane. Need to continue to pray for Pat. I was gonna take her out to lunch today, but she bailed on me. She was worn out from PT. So, you say, she's gonna get better. She's gonna get better. Pray for Kathy and Mo's concert on Saturday night. We have lots of people coming from other churches. Praises to Valley Community Church for all the food and clothing. There's 2 big, huge green black bags of hats, coats, and gloves back there, and some of them are going to be coming on Saturday. If you see them and recognize who they are, it would be nice to just thank them personally. Some of you know Jane Graham, and she's going to be here for sure. Continue to pray ahead of time for Rebecca for her surgery. Get you prayed up ahead of time. Loving God, thank you for these folks who are willing to come out tonight to talk about that old story. And to talk about how come we celebrate Christmas when we do now. As we go through to Christmas, help us not to get so caught up in the sounds, and the busyness, and the hecticness, but just at some point to stop and sit and imagine that manger scene and put ourselves there. In your name we pray.